I did. We all did. Okay, Jessica, can you cue me when we're live? I don't
We are
see it
live.
Oh, we are live. Okay,
We are
perfect.
live.
All right.
It's
We are
alive!
live.
It's alive!
All right, welcome everyone. My name is Leslie Kirby, and I'm the chair of the Community Relations Committee of the Jewish Federation and Jewish Foundation of Nashville and Middle Tennessee. Welcome to our weekly Lunch and Learn. I am sort of broadcasting to you live from Hilton Head, and so if I disappear, Avi Poster is going to take over for me today. Avi hopefully is on the call already. Yes, he is. Okay, so we have as our guest today Rabbi Lori Rice from our own congregation, Micah, locally, and she is going to be discussing with us reactions to the Barry Weiss program that we had a week or so ago, and pretty much anything else that you guys want to ask about. I know there's a lot going on in the world this week. So welcome, Rabbi Rice. Can you start off by talking to us just a little bit about your kind of take-home messages that you would say from the program in case we have people on who didn't watch the event?
Yes, thanks so much for having me, and thank you to Federation. And we can start by talking about the Barry Weiss event. We could go on to the Matzah, the situation in Israel, and anything else that's on your mind circulating around those topics. Happy to share my opinion, which is just my singular opinion and perspective, but perhaps could be helpful as you sort out your own views on things. So I was delighted, and again, thank you to Federation, to have Barry Weiss be with our community, and we shared her with several communities, other Reform communities around the country. I was a little bit nervous isn't the right word, but hesitant about what it might be like to engage in conversation with Barry Weiss, because sometimes I've agreed wholeheartedly with what it is that she writes, and sometimes not so much. So when I first engaged with her book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, I was just blown away and moved, frankly, by what she had to share with us. Her experience coming out of the massacre at Tree of Life Synagogue, where she grew up, and how that really changed her perspective and kind of raised her awareness as a Jew to the severity of anti-Semitism and what can result from it today in 2020, 2021. And her sort of prescription for what we can do when we encounter anti-Semitism, the idea that living as a Jew with pride and living openly and overtly in our full distinction as Jews, as one of the sort of diet tricks or nutrition tricks to dealing with and countering the anti-Semitism in the world today, I found to be a really powerful message for Jews of all ages, and especially our kids and our emerging teens and young adults. So I came out of reading that particular book feeling like Barry Weiss is just, a sister in the world for me. And then she published a piece in Tablet magazine that I believe was entitled Stop Being Shocked. And that piece was published on October 14th. And I found that piece to be a bit more disagreeable for me. I read it several times, and what I found disagreeable about it was, appropriately, she really challenged the progressive left, Jewish left and progressive left in America. And my first reaction was, how could you write a piece like this, just weeks before an election where we need to have a change in leadership? That was, again, my personal perspective was I could not endure 4 more years of a President Trump. And so I just was frustrated that even though she felt like the progressive left needed to be challenged, how could she publish that piece in October? Couldn't she just wait 1 month and publish it after the election? And one of the things that frustrated me about that piece was that I felt like she was putting things, kind of giving us an ultimatum. If we were left-leaning Jews, we had to pick a lane. And the lane we tended to want to pick was not the lane that was appropriate for us to pick anymore if we were to put our Judaism first. So I felt defensive and frustrated with her her view that she put forward in that piece. And so that's how I came into the conversation with her about a week and a half ago, when the Federation and many of us hosted her with us. But I found her perspective and rationale around, some of the choices we have before us to be very level-headed and very rational. And here's what I walked away with from her discussion with us. I walked away with not that I need to pick a lane and I can't be a progressive Jew in America today. What I came away with was that if I want to be a Jew and progressive, then I might actually have my own specific lane within the progressive left. And that's not always going to be easy, and that it takes some courage, social courage. And the best way I can explain it is the way I explained it to one of our college students who called me from her university yesterday in the Northeast. She's at a small liberal university, where she said, anti-Israel has slipped into anti-Semitic in about 2 seconds, and I need some help. I don't know, she said to me, if I should speak out or if it's best for me just to kind of take my finals and leave. And while I couldn't tell her whether she should speak out or not, I tried to give her some advice to guide her decision. And what I said, which is what I learned from Barry about a week and a half ago, and that is that many of the causes that I care about and that this particular student cares about, reproductive rights, the equality of Black lives, gun control, equity for women in America. So things like the Women's March and BLM that we've always felt like, yes, that's where I stand. That all of a sudden, if standing in that space means I have to abdicate my full identity and pride as a Jew and support of, in many cases, the state of Israel, then I need to think about how I'm supporting those initiatives. It doesn't mean I can't say I support 99% of what the BLM movement also supports. But that piece where I need to align myself with Louis Farrakhan, the piece where I have to say, I'm going to kind of sort of hide the Jewish part of me so I can attend the rally, or I want to be part of the Women's March, but I'm willing to kind of give up this part of who I am so that I can fit in and be, as Barry Weiss said, in the cool kids club. That doesn't feel good. That feels wrong in my gut. So how can I be fully supportive of everything, for the most part, that BLM and the Women's March advocates for and supports, but still be fully myself in my own identity? And sometimes that means saying, these are the things that I'm in support of, but I disagree with this piece of it. And you may not appreciate that, but I won't let you cancel me because I want to remain distinctive in my identity, set apart because, yes, I am a Jew, and because I think that the state of Israel is vitally important, and I can't imagine living in a world where that is not a reality. That's not going to necessarily gain me or the student that I was advising points in popularity with all circles, but with some it will. So I know that some of you have probably seen the op-ed that Imam Osama Balul posted in the Tennessean, where he calls upon clergy of all faiths and stripes to condemn the desecration of holy sites in Israel. And I think at face value, all of us would agree that the desecration of holy sites is not okay and something that we should all be against. And I'm actually very friendly and have an adoration for Osama. I truly love him and his family. And I can see from where he sits why he would write the op-ed that he did, and he is completely entitled to his opinion. I just strongly disagree. I disagree about the positioning of Israel primarily as and only as the aggressor that has brought on the situation that we are currently experiencing in Israel. So I'm happy to talk more about that, but I think that with a lot of pieces that are written, there's always a slant, and there are often details that are omitted that give perhaps a fuller picture. And in this case, and it's an op-ed, by the way, it's not a historical piece, so he's not obligated to share, he's giving his opinion, and it's his opinion, just like this is mine. But that was my biggest takeaway from Barry, was that it's not an either or. I don't have to decide I'm either with BLM or I'm not. I'm either standing at the Women's March or I'm not. There's nuance and there's spectrum. And because we're Jews who have a strong cultural, religious, social imperative, that we fit somewhere on the spectrum, but it's not all or nothing, and it doesn't have to be. We can still be on the progressive left and remain distinctive as Jews and Zionist if that's what we choose. I'm going to pause there and open it for questions or comments so that we can continue the conversation.
And I think people can just unmute and ask questions themselves, or as usual, you can put it in the chat and then I'll convey to Rabbi Lori. While you guys start formulating your questions, let me just follow up with what you're talking about. So kind of a combination of Barry and also what's happening in Israel this week. I'm traveling right now with my family, which, as you know, Rabbi, includes 2 college-age children who are both who both identify as very progressive. They're really struggling right now, and I feel like those of us who have been around the block a few times, so to speak, can better articulate the lane that you're just talking about and what you took away from the Barry Weiss program, which is a nuanced approach, finding our own niche and not letting other people define that for us. But what do you say? What did you say to the college student who reached out to you? They really feel like to be progressive and to be in that lane where they really want to be, that they have to, at best, not really talk about Israel. And so what do we say? I mean, it's easy for us to say, you just have to explain to people, but for a 20-year-old, that's not an easy thing to do. So what do we do for our young people to help this be easier?
Yeah, and for a 50-year-old, it's not easy to do. So I can appreciate that so much. So I'm going to give an example. And this was one that I shared yesterday. So I don't know how many of you, and thank you to Betty Lichstein for engaging me in this conversation yesterday as well, how many of you saw the New York Times essay Peter Beinart wrote entitled "Palestinian Refugees Deserve to Return Home. Jews Should Understand." It's a very compelling essay. Peter Beinart is a very skilled writer and weaves a narrative together beautifully. And at face value, the idea that Jews should understand the desire to return to a homeland. I mean, of course, for thousands of years, that's all we yearn to do. And our liturgy and our poetry speaks to this longing to return back to our Jewish homeland. And so the meat of the article of Beinart's thesis is that Palestinians deserve the same, and we should understand that, right? Why are we blinding ourselves to that piece? And he references something about 4 or 5 paragraphs down, and I'm just going to read 2 sentences from it. He says, "None of this means refugee return would be simple or uncontested. Efforts at historical justice rarely are. But there is a reason the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates ends his famous essay on reparations for segregation and slavery with the subprime mortgage crisis that forced many Black Americans into foreclosure in the first decade of the 21st century. The crimes of the past, when left unaddressed, do not remain in the past. That's also the lesson of the evictions that have set Israel-Palestine aflame. More than 7 years ago, Palestinians were expelled to create a Jewish state. Now they are being expelled to make Jerusalem a Jewish city. By refusing to acknowledge this, the Israeli government and its American Jewish allies ensure that this expulsion continues, this destruction for the Palestinian people." So I want to comment on that because I think, Leslie, to your point, your teens, my teens, look at that and they say, oh my gosh, well, we are on the side of reparations and righting the wrongs of segregation and the ongoing consequences of slavery, the original American sin here in our own country, right? And many of us would feel that same way. But let's unpack this parallel that Beinart gave to us. What essentially he did was he said that Jews are, in this comparison, this metaphor, the equivalent of the white American segregationist. At no time prior to the existence of the state of Israel, during those thousands of years of Jews in the diaspora, did Jews ever have the power and the security and the upper hand of the white American. Let's leave the word segregation out of this. Let's just say white American. The idea that the two would even be the same, that the power level or the vulnerability of the Jew is the same, is completely not a parallel. And let's just take, for example, Black Americans who, to my knowledge, both from Black Americans that I'm friends with, colleagues with, in professional relationship with, or those that whose writings I have read, for the most part, have no desire to push the rest of white America into the neighboring oceans or to see their blood spill into those seas. So already it's an imperfect comparison. But the way it's written, if my teens or Leslie, your teens were to read this piece, how would their heartstrings not be pulled? Like, of course, absolutely, this makes so much sense. So we have to be, I think, very discerning in what we're reading. Discerning is not the same as defensive. Defensive shuts down our ability to be open-minded. I still feel like there's compassion for any people, Palestinian or otherwise, who are uprooted from their home, who are the victims, innocent victims of warfare and clashes. And none of that is okay. We don't abdicate a search for peace and civility because of it. But we have to be careful, I think, about some of these comparisons and parallels that are made that are meant to pull on our progressive sensibilities. Were it this simple, we long to return because every time we lived outside our land, we were murdered, burned, locked up, imprisoned, enslaved. The list could go on. And while it's, again, not right that Palestinians perhaps don't have the opportunity to return to what they see as their ancestral homeland, it's not that simple. Nothing, and I would underscore and underline, nothing yet, historically, to this moment, guarantees the security of Jews or of Israel. And sadly, were we to assimilate and return all Palestinians to share the land. And sadly, the bottom line is that after all that we have survived as a Jewish people over the years historically, all that we've been through, we're just not prepared to take any chances, right? It's why the IDF responds with the force that they do, which is often coded as disproportionate in the news. There's just no room for us as a people for a gentle slap on the wrist, right? After what we've learned. And so, and it's not, there are many people like perhaps our teens who would say, but we're living in a different time. Here we are in America. It's really comfortable to be Jewish. Ironically, as I sit and talk with you today, I've truly never experienced firsthand anti-Semitism. I've just never experienced it. I'm so blessed to have not had that be something that I've had to confront. But Sarah Halimi in France, who was murdered because she was a Jew by her neighbor, who will now not be prosecuted because it's considered mental dispensation because he was high on marijuana. This is still something we're dealing with. So lest we convince ourselves that we're living at a time where maybe we can let up a little bit, I just think that the state of Israel, who lives in that neighborhood every day, and the IDF, who lives in that neighborhood every day, smartly won't do it. So I've just shared a lot, but Leslie, that's my long-winded response to your question.
Thank you. I think part of it is that, they're getting their information in a different way than we do. And so what they're really seeing is memes about Israel rather than actual news about Israel. And that's a very different thing, but we could talk for hours about that.
Right. And people that get the news from TikTok, it's frightening, but there are a lot of people out there.
So Tina posted a question in the chat about the kind of maybe the impetus for this recent crisis, which we could debate about what the real impetus is, but a lot of the news attention has been focused on the eviction of Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And she noted a report that she had seen that those numbers are maybe not so high as they have been reported in some mainstream news. Do you know anything about that?
So what I would say, I can't speak to the actual numbers. I'm never good at numbers, to be honest, but this is my sort of balcony view of things, is that this particular issue of this one neighborhood and the real estate dispute of what was never confirmed as Palestinian land, and then the Jordanians, no longer control that area, and then that neighborhood, and then it was actually sold to a Jewish property rights. I don't know the numbers, but I think that specific situation is just a hot button and touches a very sore spot around territorial issues, which are at the heart of the strife between Palestinians and Jews in the land of Israel. So it stirs up that already sort of continuingly simmering issue about whose land is this, who gets to live here, who has control over this territory. And then add to that, if we're going to add to the cauldron, if you will, the heightened time of Ramadan, which is a very sacred time for our Muslim brothers and sisters. And not just Ramadan, but then the Temple Mount / Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the incredibly heated tension around that holy site for both Jews and for Muslims, and all of the Jewish holidays that come this time, specifically Jerusalem Day, where it is now sort of a tradition for some of our extremist right Jewish brethren, although I don't love calling them my brethren because they frustrate me to no end, who parade not just through Jerusalem, which is fine, but also specifically up and around the Temple Mount in an inciting way. So you have all these pieces that are like coming together at one time, and this issue around the real estate, and everything just kind of bubbles over, which is, to me, is what it seems like has happened here. All of these pieces like thrown into a cauldron that just start to spatter out. And now we have what we have, which is a semblance of like civil war unrest in multiple cities throughout Israel between Arabs and Jews, and Hamas, who's trying to assert their power over a weak Mahmoud Abbas, to demonstrate, look, we've got you, when really they don't. Tactically, they can't even compare to what Israel can do, which then leads to, on the world stage, look at Israel's disproportionate response. Well, Israel's got its shit together when it comes to defending itself. Excuse my language. And well, they should. They're not taking any chances. So all of that comes together to give us what we've got.
So somebody, and I'm going to come back to some of the other questions from Dina and others in a second, but somebody just texted me privately.
Up in Avi too. Go ahead, Leslie.
Yes, but somebody just texted me, and you don't have to comment on this if you don't want to, but that there are also starting to be reports that this is, obviously the factors that you just talked about weren't under his control, but that this is at least playing into the hands of Netanyahu in terms of the current election. Do you want to speculate about that, or do you want to punt on that one?
I would just say yes. I think it's true. And this is the roller coaster of politics in Israel. It always has been, and it always is, So, that comment is spot on.
Right.
I don't really know that there's more to say. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me see. From Deanna, just the idea that, and again, tying back into what Barry talked about in her presentation, that thinking about either Black Lives Matter or the Women's March as a one-person movement would be a mistake, and that affiliating with a particular individual around those is not the same as affiliating with the movement. I guess a broader question we could ask about that is kind of what people talk about as bedfellows. So, yeah. We get a lot of people who are supporting Israel, and we see that in the current situation as well. Right. So to what extent do you feel like where's your red line? Like, who do you talk to? Who do you not, in terms of who's supporting Israel and who's, doing other things that we don't love?
It's a tough one for me. I don't think I have a firm algorithm that can be applied to every situation. And I do believe, and Avi and I have talked about this at length, and I think with Erwin too, I do believe in the concept of intersectionality, that learning is ongoing. And so, I was reminded of a really beautiful story that I think speaks to this of Derrick Black and Matthew Stevenson. Some of you may remember the story. Derrick Black was the white power heir apparent. David Duke is his godfather, and he went to the New College in Florida as an undergrad, and he was outed as, this white power heir apparent, and he was canceled on campus. And the one person who befriended him was this Orthodox Jew named Matthew Stevenson, who over a series of years and Shabbat dinners befriended him, brought him into Shabbat dinners. This gentleman, Derrick, met, Matthew's friends, other Jews, and eventually came to really see a different side of things, and then, ultimately renounced white power, white supremacy, and so on and so forth, and now is no longer connected to his family or that movement in any way. And they have spoken all over the country about their relationship in that process. And I think that, just even if I disagree, say, with Imam Osama's op-ed, that does not in any way impact my a respect for and appreciation for him as a human being and as a person, and the friendship that we have. And I think one of the things we have to be careful of is if we're going to cancel on one side, we have to say, are we willing to cancel on the other? And so I take a lot of heat from members of my own family who say, oh, you want to be friends with those Muslims? Well, are they willing to renounce Hamas? And I'm not willing to draw that line in the sand. I want to continue to have the conversation. I'd rather have the conversation about it and have the interplay back and forth. Now, there are other things that for me are easier to say, here's my line in the sand. Actually, interestingly enough, reproductive rights isn't even one of them. While I feel strongly about where I sit on that issue, I appreciate that if religiously you believe that life begins at conception and that therefore abortion is murder, then you are at an impasse. Am I not going to have a conversation with you about it? Absolutely not. But there are other things like the full humanity of somebody who loves someone of the same sex. That's a no-brainer for me. I don't see how there are multiple sides to that. But anyway, now we're getting off topic. So I don't have a definitive line in the sand, and I really believe that intersectionality has a lot of merit.
Somebody posted.
Okay. Leslie, Judy's had her hand up for a long time. Can we just go to Judy?
Okay. Yes, Judy.
Okay. Going back to last week's program and Barry Weiss, what you were just talking about, intersectionality, I mean, I'm a strong believer in that. And I see the problem as trying to explain to those people who are either anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist or whatever, just why I can't follow their beliefs or can't agree with their beliefs. Right. And part of it is that in some sense, even with today, with what's going on in Israel and Palestine, there are things about Israel that I really disagree with. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not an Israel right or wrong kind of person. And it's very hard for me sometimes to defend some of the things that Israel does while still totally supporting Israel. Yeah. And I find that to be a very difficult line. And I don't know whether you have any ideas or any suggestions about that, but I am totally uneasy now. I mean, I've got this pit in my stomach from what's going on over there now, and I'm totally in support of Israel, but there are still ideas in my head that say, well, it's not all right or wrong.
And it is not all right or wrong, Judy. I think you're so right. I think it was my colleague, Rabbi Angela Warnick-Bookdahl, who phrased it for me this way. She said, there's a whole lot in America that we're not for either, but we've not yet renounced our American citizenship. And we still are grateful and blessed to live in this country and feel that way every day, even during the last 4 years, which were a test of that love and devotion. And so I apply that really to how I approach the state of Israel. So like, that's why I try and go to, we're all on the dance floor, and we're in the mix, and we're in the midst of the heat and the fire because we care and we're passionate. But it's important for us to step back onto the balcony and see it from a bird's eye view, because when we're in the mix, we can't help but see that the first 2 casualties in Gaza were children. And it's like, well, how can we support that in any way? I mean, none of us on this Zoom would purport that the loss of the killing of innocent children is in any way justifiable. And especially as Jews, we have, I hope all of us, a really strong moral and ethical compulsion that's driven by our sense of faith and our religious tradition. And so it's important to step off the dance floor to be able to remember that it's yes, that we should be bothered and upset and feel sick in our gut. And what are our options? In other words, is not having a Jewish state an option? I know I'm coming really far back. No, I would say for me, it's not an option. Okay, well, what other scenarios have been put forward that then allow for there to be something other than what we're continually engaged in, which is this back and forth between extremists? And I say between extremists because I think that your moderate Israeli and your sort of grassroots, like the people that I know who are working on both from the Arab community and from the Palestinian community specifically, who want the same things that Arab parents want. I mean, that Israeli parents want, like their children to thrive and grow up and have lives. That they are not in support of sort of fanning these flames, but they're also not the ones in power who are making decisions about what happens. I mean, we couldn't remotely put the label moderate on Hamas. And, as much as I'm not the biggest Netanyahu fan, I still wake up in the morning without the weight of the security of the state of Israel on my shoulders. And I try to remind myself that every day before I'm too judgmental. So it's complicated. I think for me, the best I can do is to listen to that discomfort and that nausea that sits in the pit of my stomach, and continue to read and discern. But at the end of the day, I can't do anything but support the need for a Jewish state, I guess I would say.
All right, great. Avi. Avi, you're muted.
First, one comment to the Federation on Osama's op-ed. I only read it really quickly. I would not overreact to that particular piece. What he was defending is some religious sites that even Israelis think the response on top of Temple Mount was a little bit heavy-handed. And for Muslims, seeing a gas canister go off inside the mosque on the Temple Mount, that's pretty emotional for them. And I'm not defending it. I'm just suggesting that we just look at that column.
Yeah.
It wasn't the condemnation we've seen from other places. So I wouldn't want to start up with going back and forth with friends. I think, Laura, you calling Osama is the best bet. But as far as Sheikh Jarrah, I do think that was a lightning rod. I think it's an intentional move by the religious right to disrupt the neighborhood that has been relatively quiet. The families that are being dislodged have been there for 60 years or more. Maybe they haven't paid their rent on time. I don't know. It's more than a real estate transaction. It's an intentional. And Palestinians see it as one more proverbial nail in their coffin.
And I think, Avi, that's what Judy's speaking about, that frustration of like, why are we agitating this?
And Israel needs to look at itself. The time a Supreme Court decision on Sheikh Jarrah during the week of Ramadan makes no sense.
Sure.
The fact that the parade came on the same day as the end of Ramadan, Israel could 3 weeks ago have dealt with that.
Yeah.
And I'm not defending any of it. My sister is in danger right now. But I just think we need to step back and look and analyze what's gone down before we reach the far corners of our arguments.
I think Erwin and then Howard had a question. So Erwin first and then Howard.
I want to go back to the initial premise of Bari Weiss. I took her up on her option to sign up for her newsletter on FAIR and delved into it. And I would characterize that particular platform as being a public intellectual Braver Angels. I mean, it contains a wide range of thinking, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't, which is pretty much what Lori said about Bari Weiss. I mean, you know, and it really, if you take it, is really the way we should be looking at the world. We cannot agree with everybody 100% of the time. And we shouldn't agree with anybody 100% of the time. You know, her platform includes a fair number of African-American intellectuals who don't agree with Ibram Kendi.
Right.
And I think it's worthwhile to have that discussion, you know, to sort of think about this and what are we really talking about? Because that's what's going to move us further. You know, staying in our silos and listening to what each other talk doesn't move us anywhere. So I would encourage everybody to engage in these thinking. You know, I remember a number of years ago, the Federation sponsored a series about how one processes conflict, and what we have here are arguments for the sake of heaven. And I think it's worthwhile to engage in that, to challenge ourselves, to, as Lori says, identify and figure out those things that are most important to us, and then push back on those things that are most important to us without sacrificing our identity.
Yeah. And I would, to follow on Erwin, your comments, I would be wary of anything that requires you to be either or. There's got to be room for the and. We're allowed to be, you know, an ongoing work in progress. One of my stickies on my bathroom mirror that I see each morning says I'm allowed to be perfect as I am and a work in progress every day. And I think that's for all of us, and that we're allowed to change our minds too. And one of my favorite things about having Barry with us was that I walked away thinking differently about something I hadn't thought about before, and I always appreciate that. So, yeah. Howard.
Great. Howard.
Yeah, so I think one thing we can all agree on is that we don't care for anti-Semitism. And so, you know, there were 100%. I then don't know whether I'm 100% for or against her concept of that being the same as Jew hatred. You didn't use that term, you didn't mention it, but boy, it raised my level of what is it that we're really talking about? It says it so much better. And I'll take that one step further to say, when I hear you say that you haven't been discriminated against, do we not want to look at it? You know, individually, I may be in the same place, but as a community, when you look at the desecration of the Holocaust Memorial not too long ago, when you look at the shot at the West End Synagogue,
Sure.
You know, when you look at the AE fraternity, all Jewish, that within the last 5-6 years was desecrated twice. Cannot we say that we've been discriminated against in a communal sense? So your thoughts?
Howard, you're completely right, and I was making the comment more just as a person, that against me as an individual. But you're right, as a community, we've experienced it time and time again. I personally appreciated her use of the word Jew hatred as opposed to anti-Semitism. I think anti-Semitism has become so neutralized as a term, and similarly to the way that the word depression is neutralized, right? We say, oh, I'm so depressed, the movie isn't playing on the day I want to see it, or but for somebody who actually suffers from clinical depression, that's a completely different thing. But we've taken that term and we've overused it so much in cliche ways that it no longer necessarily carries the same weight that it should, undoubtedly should. And I think anti-Semitism is similar, and I think that's where Barry was going with that. That when we say Jew hatred, it makes the hairs on the back of our neck stand up because that's what it is. And when I was explaining to an old friend of mine who's not Jewish what's going on in Israel, at the end of our conversation, I said, at the end of the day, I still can't figure it out except that it's just Jew hatred. Why somebody cares more about the displacement of Palestinian refugees than refugees anywhere else in the world? Why Israel continues to take the scrutiny that it does and the beating that it does from public from the public state, from the world stage? I mean, it's Jew hatred, and the acts like Sarah Halimi in France, or the bullet in West End Synagogue, or the desecration of our Holocaust memorial. I mean, that's what it is. And so I think why it bothered so many people, and I don't hear you saying that it bothered you, but it just definitely, raised your awareness, is because perhaps deep down, we want to think that we've moved to a new place and we're not where we once were. And how could the Holocaust ever happen again? Surely the world has changed. But the march in Charlottesville and a president of the United States who can say there are, good people on both sides, I think is a red flag to us that Jew hatred is alive and well and still completely mind-boggling to those of us who don't totally understand why that's the most ancient canard there is. So all that is to say, you're right. Our community has certainly experienced it. And as a member of the community, that is my experience with anti-Semitism. And I think perhaps we should be calling it Jew hatred so that we can understand, and maybe for our younger community members, teens and young adults, that it's not necessarily such a different time, and we need to be vigilant. Thank you.
Very good point. I think most people would agree that the other side, whatever it is, has a better publicist than Israel does in terms of talking about some of these issues. And it loops back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier with the intersectionality and what it means to be progressive. I think part of what happened this week is that we see how quickly and how intently anti-Zionism switches into anti-Semitism. And even among some of our friends who wouldn't call themselves anti-Semitic, they don't see the line where it crosses over. And I think that's our job of going back and telling them, like, think about it. If you really aren't jumping up and down screaming about these other things, are you really pro-human rights, or are you just being anti-Israel? So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to think through that a little bit. There's not an easy answer to that, but certainly it's a dialogue that I think we need to be having with a lot of our friends.
Yeah.
Avi, I think you want to loop back to a question about the women's movement.
Well, I had one question about Barry, Laura. When you were mentioning to her that you were dedicated to the women's movement, and she basically challenged you to leave and start your own movement.
Yeah.
I mean, not all of us can leave and start our own movements.
In all your free time.
Can you talk to the importance of staying in those tents and speaking up loudly as a means to educate others? I mean, I thought I heard her say, leave those tents and go off in your own place and start your own.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Avi, she said that's what was the right choice for her. And I've been thinking about it so much since then. And you and I have had conversations about this. And I think we've had them publicly in our own Observer, right, here in Nashville. My takeaway was that I don't have to leave the tent but I probably need to wear my I Stand with Israel t-shirt when I go to the tent.
Right.
And that might take a bit more courage than it would to just leave the tent and start my own march.
Absolutely.
And that's what I said to our college student on the phone yesterday, that it might be easier just to say nothing and walk away, or you can decide if you're willing to kind of take the consequences of putting your I Stand with Israel pin on and engaging in the conversation. So for me, I think I would rather stay in as a identifiable and proud Jew and lover of Israel. But you know, that's hard to do sometimes, but that would be my choice.
So Erwin and Marty have both kind of referenced the recent op-ed that Barry wrote on Israel that I sent to you yesterday.
Yeah.
And Erwin's comment just now was, it's a lot harder to defend somebody who has the optics of power than the optics of somebody without power.
Yeah.
Did you have reactions to that specific piece? I know Avi did. So let me get your take and then he can maybe comment as well.
Well, for the most part, I really appreciated the piece. But Erwin, when we talk about the optics of power, and it's easier to sort of side and empathize with the victim rather than the oppressor, and I'm going to use those terms because those are the ones that are often used when it comes to Israelis and Palestinians. One of my mentors, Rabbi Janet Martyr, who is since retired from the congregational world, wrote a really beautiful and impactful sermon where she talked about why is it that for us as Jews, we would almost rather see our people marched into a crematoria than stand confidently with, you know, AKs and Uzis in their hand. There's something really screwed up in where we're in need of like collective communal therapy, that is a more palatable image for us as a people. And so the fact is that this is the first time in history, right? I mean, I guess we could go back and you could say the Maccabees and others, but really in sort of modern history since 1948, where the Jew looks like that, right? Isn't just like the weak, hungry, ghetto Jew who has no power and is completely vulnerable. And for many people, that's just a really uncomfortable visual and idea. And they just would rather actually have the other. And the narrative for the Jew is the victim for thousands and thousands of years, the exiled, weak, vulnerable victim. So I appreciate where Barry's coming from, because I do think it's time for us to do a little bit of heshbon hanefesh, of reflecting of the soul on that subject, and say, why is it that we would almost rather that? It just feels better ethically, morally, like, oh, we get it, we're also still enslaved. Guess what? We left Egypt a long time ago and we're still recovering. So
I think that's an excellent point. And Avi and I are both basketball fans, and we joke sometimes that everybody's for the underdog except when it's your team.
yeah.
And then you're totally not for the underdog, you're for your team. But I think this idea of soul searching on this issue is a very good one. Avi, do you want to follow up on the op-ed? And I just posted it in the chat for anyone who hasn't seen that op-ed. Oh, sorry, Eric, do you have a question?
Well, I wanted to just thank you. I want to share a comment, which is that my observation, which actually goes back to Erwin's note in the chat about the optics of having power and wielding that power when Israel is seen as being powerful, as opposed to Rabbi Laurie's point about being the entity that's the weaker entity. And so if you think about the way in which Israel is portrayed, or the way the United States is portrayed in responding to or confronting terrorism, or confronting a threat to its citizens, as opposed to Russia or China, for instance, where when you think about what Russia did in Chechnya or what China is doing to the Uyghurs, I mean, you know, there's absolutely no balance in terms of how the media portrays it, because quite frankly, Israel and the United States get lambasted for disproportionate use of force, whereas Russia and China have annihilated people, and you can't even find a reference to it virtually in any publication, because, you know, a democracy, a Western-style democracy that is wielding power is held to a completely different standard, and I think unfairly, to those dictatorships, which are quite frankly far more brutal and exercise no restraint.
And I think, and thank you, Eric. And yes, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I want to just come back to, because I would hate for anybody to get off of this session and feel like, okay, well, still, what do I do? Kind of coming back to you, Judy, and your point of what do I do with the fact that as a human being, I empathize with others who are displaced, the loss of innocent life. How can I substantiate that? Am I ignoring that piece for the sake of my Zionism? And that's part of the yes and. I think we can be supporters of a Jewish state and recognize the imperative for Israel to continue and to be there, and feel sick to our stomach at the loss of life, and feel like there needs to be an unending, overturn every single rock, search for a peaceful way forward. I just think both can coexist at the same time. And if being a Jew is not holding two different realities at once, for me, the world is created, I am but dust and ashes. I mean, that's just one example. Then there's no people that gets that better than we do. So I think it's okay to move forward with that.
That's a good reminder of the nuance that we need to keep in mind. Adam, I think you have a question.
Well, a couple of comments. And to one thing that Rabbi Laurie was saying, it's interesting. The Jewish Agency a number of years ago created a program called Hugging and Wrestling, right? That you can wrestle with Israel within the context of hugging it. And this was specifically designed for teenagers, high school students, and college students who, face, as we all know, face these challenges of being proudly Jewish, and then really for the first time in their lives, usually when they go to college, of being confronted with these challenges and these questions and not knowing what to do, and having this conflict of wanting to be, sympathetic for human rights, but also being a proud Jew. So they came up with this lovely, conversation of hugging and wrestling, which allows people, to criticize, to comment on Israel and saying, I don't like this or I don't like that, at the same time doing it in the context of love. And then to go back to the victim mentality, it's very interesting that when I was in Israel on a national young leadership mission, the day that we were going to Yad Vashem, they had a speaker, and the speaker asked for people to name, and it was an entirely American audience, name the Holocaust figure who didn't survive the Holocaust that they think is the top of their mind. And for most American kids, they thought of Anne Frank. Then she asked, who do you think Israelis think of in the same vein? And no one could give an answer, but she said, it's Mordechai Anilevich and Chana Senesh. And what's the classic difference between those two and Anne Frank? That Israelis see Mordechai Anilevich and Chana Senesh as warriors. They didn't confine themselves, and this is, and you hate saying this because it sounds terrible about Anne Frank, but Israelis don't see Anne Frank, as she said, as a model, because she hid. Whereas Anilevich knew he was going to die, but he went out throwing Molotov cocktails and taking some Nazis with him. And we all know that Chana Senesh died as a paratrooper, across enemy lines. And she said, this is this quintessential difference between Israelis who have no interest in surviving. They have an interest in living, as compared to kind of like the non-Israeli Jewish world in some cases when it comes to Holocaust figures. And it was a very, very interesting conversation she had with us about the distinction between the two, and how Israelis will say, we always talk about, as I said here, that we're very bad. Israelis are bad at PR, but then Israelis would say we couldn't care less, right? We just couldn't care less about how we look like in the media, right? We don't care if we look like victims. A very close friend of mine once asked when Rabin became prime minister, he said, "You think Israelis voted for Rabin because?" And I said to him, "Stephen, let me tell you, Israelis don't care what the rest of the world thinks. They will do what is good for them, because just that's the Israeli mentality of life, and good for them." And yes, we're kind of forced to pick up the pieces, I guess, sometimes, right? But I think we sometimes understand that we're dealing with brothers and sisters who are, they're not worried about optics because they're worried about fighting for their lives. And it's a very different calculation of risk and decision making that they make compared to, our challenges every day.
Yeah, good point, Adam. Thank you.
Avi?
I'm thinking out loud because are you guys familiar with an organization called If Not Now? You are, Eric. I went on their call last night and it scared the hell out of me. This is a group of young Jewish kids, primarily, who believe Israel's behavior in the West Bank isn't consistent with their worldview and how people are treated. And I read their chats, and many of them seem to acknowledge coming from Orthodox homes or Jewish homes whose parents are now disowning them. I don't know if that means literally, but they claim their parents are disowning them because they disagree on issues related to Israel. And there were I think the count was 480 on the call, and they were all in their 20s. And I'm thinking to myself, these are kids that say they love Israel, but they disagree with Israel. We're losing some of those kids. And it was, I just never heard that voice that loud coming from our young in one place as I did last night. I left really disturbed.
Avi, just as a comment, and Eric can tell me if I'm wrong, that so there was a couple of years ago a video of some college students associated with If Not Now who purposely went on a birthright trip for the sole reason to videotape it in a way to criticize the birthright people for saying, well, we don't like this agenda. And they purposely tried to go out of their way to make the birthright professionals to look unfeeling and uncaring. So it's kind of an interesting thing. It's about when we talk about cancel culture, right? That they have a very specific position. They can have that. That's, fine. We don't have to agree with it. I don't have to agree with it. But they have no interest in having. This is just like on the other side. They have no interest in having the discussion. They wanted to have the optic, right? Big bad birthright, which only cares about the Israeli position and doesn't like Palestinians. And they tried to go out of their way to show, which is interesting, is the birthright professional they were trying to shame was nothing but professional the entire way through the secret videotaping that they were making. So, they kind of are who they are. It'd be nice if they cared about actually having a discussion about their positions, but they have no interest.
That wasn't my point. Even though I know your incident, but to dismiss them based on that incident when we have so many hundreds that we know of and many more that we don't, that are struggling with their Jewish identity and Israel, to dismiss that as they go about their business wrong, we're going to lose these kids. We've got to bring them in somehow. And I don't know how to do it, but I'll
just follow up on what you're both saying. Both of my kids, and I don't know how they got them, but I don't know where If Not Now is getting their mailing list, but both of my kids are members of their college Hillels, different colleges, and they've been directly contacted by If Not Now recruiting them. And again, I don't know where they get these mailing lists, but all of us on this call are going to roll our eyes at what If Not Now is saying, but we will dismiss them at our own peril, because Avi is right. They have a very slick message. It's very appealing to kids, and they don't think they're wrong. They think we are lost and they are the ones who have the right answer. And, again, I'm not sure what the right answer is, just like what Avi said, but they're a real growing group and they're carrying a lot of weight among young people. All right. I want to be respectful of Rabbi Laurie's time. I told her we would lock this up at an hour. So if you have any final comments or things like that, you can put them in the chat, or I'm sure if you email Rabbi Laurie later, she would be happy to email you back. I want to thank Rabbi Laurie for joining us today and having this conversation. When I originally asked her, I intended it to focus a lot more on Barry Weiss and didn't know this thing with Israel was going to pop up. So I appreciate your flexibility and being able to kind of meander around. And I would encourage all of you, if you know anybody in their 20s and 30s, we are about to start a new program. Rabbi Laurie is one of the hosts in our community called Resetting the Table. It's an attempt to have a mature dialogue with people about Israel and to better educate people to articulate their feelings and also facts about Israel, because facts are important as well. And we're still recruiting. We'll be starting in June, the next round of those conversations. So if you know people, there's not a really strict age limit, but we are trying to aim for younger people who seem to be a little bit more in need of this kind of programming. So if you know people, you can let Rabbi Lori or myself know. Rabbi Lori, did you want to have a final comment?
No, thank you for promoting that, because yes, we want to have a nice critical mass for resetting the table. I think it's going to be an incredible program. I think we've targeted to like 45 and under. So if you know of people that would be great for it, send them either my way or to Leslie's would be terrific, and Eric's too. And I just want to say thank you so much. I'm more than willing to have individual conversations about this. I'm thinking about it all the time, changing my mind, developing how I react, as you are too. So the best I think we can do is continue to have the conversation. It's very helpful. And Shabbat Shalom. And Shavua Tov. I was going to say Hag Sameach, because Shavuot is right around the corner for us as well.
Yes, for sure. All right. Jessica, do you have the information on next week's speaker? I don't have it in front of me.
Leslie, just to let you, I talked to my niece yesterday, and she is making blintzes and cheesecakes. And she said, despite the rockets coming, despite the jets flying over Ashdod, they are going to eat sweets and celebrate Shavuot.
And that is what it is to be
Amen.
the bitter and the sweet. I love it.
All right.
I am looking. I don't have it right in front of me, Leslie. I apologize.
Okay, it's okay. So next week we're going to be having somebody from Turk talk about, I don't remember the name, talk about kind of current situation in Nashville around Ethiopian refugees. And then the following week, we're going to be doing May is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And we're going to be having somebody from the YWCA come and talk to us just as an educational program about domestic violence and ways to help people who are in need of resources around that. That will actually be our last lunch and learn for at least a little while. We've kind of done it weekly-ish during the pandemic, and now that things are getting a little bit back to normal, we're going to pause. I'll be rotating off as CRC chair, and we'll have an incoming chair, and Deborah's going to negotiate with that person. We may switch to doing monthly ones in the fall or something like that, but we'll have 2 more next week and the week after, and then there'll be at least a couple of month hiatus. So Leslie, thank you for joining us today, and Shabbat Shalom.
Leslie, I do have the information on May 21st. We welcome Dr. Hodes, the medical director for Jewish Distribution Committee of the Ethiopia Spine and Heart Project. Dr. Hodes will share about his work with the Ethiopian community. That will be
Dr.
all right. Thanks, everyone. Shabbat